little map there. You see this is the center of the core of three of the world's major religions. You can see the geography is uneven right now. These areas that are sparsely populated, they have in between, these are mostly nomadic people who are also usually Islamic. Let's see. Similar to Christianity, there's been a number of different splits through time. This is one of the reasons why, if you see on the news, you'll see conflicts between Iran and Iraq. And within Iraq itself, they have Shiite and Sunni Muslims, and so you have contested relationships there. And that division was about who was going to take over once Muhammad died. There was a group that felt that his heirs should take over, and then another group that felt that rather than his specific heirs, it would be people who were highly ranked in the church, right? To put it in very, very broad nutshell. Landscapes of the dead, as you can imagine, are a big part of religious landscapes. The Taj Mahal that I was showing you, the whole thing was for a deceased beloved wife. It was a wife of the emperor, and so that made it so that the Taj Mahal is usually considered one of the kind of most ornate Islamic buildings that exists. Though plenty of others are still ornate. Like I said, I'm going to show you some of Egypt, and it's a place where you see multiple religions kind of coming together in these different ways. If you see the color green on Egypt's flag, for example, right? Green has special significance in lots of different religions and belief systems, and specifically favored in Islam. Water also, and it's no coincidence that actually water is considered has a special sacred role in areas that are largely deserts, right? Water is life or death, and so it has special extra significance. Although, if you remember, in Hinduism, they also have the ritualistic bathing as a social norm. As I mentioned, these are the centers of a number of different religions, and they spread out from this way in lots of different ways. Very often, if an empire converts to a religion, and then it makes everybody within the empire have that religion, that is a big way that religion will spread over a huge area of space. This has happened with Christianity from this region and Islam from this region, but not Jewish people. It's an ethnic religion, right? It's not a universalizing religion. There's not a big effort to get people to convert. Although there are, of course, people who do convert, but it's usually people who get married and want to convert because they're married. Diffusion of Islam. But that's why the Taj Mahal was over here-ish, right? A center of part of these. And this is also, if you ever see on the news about, oppressed Muslims in China, that would be like way over here. It should be, this map should show this area a little bit more, but that's the region that they're talking about. That is, when China was a big empire and was expanding lots of places, that was kind of the last area that it took over, and it still has it, that in Tibet. When I went to Egypt, it was Christmas break, and they had a lot of Christmas stuff up, and it was, a lot of it was for tourists, because a lot of tourists actually go to the Middle East around Christmas time. Although there are local Christians. There's 13% of the Egyptian population are Christian. but it's one of those things where it's an odd version of a number of different things, right? Like there was Santa Claus stuff all over the place, but things that just didn't quite like this was. So these are bathrooms in the airport, and in the malls and everything, there are these animatronic Santa Clauses that if you went by them, they would dance and play the saxophone, which is not a thing I'd ever heard of being connected to Santa Claus, but it was like everywhere. It was everywhere. I forgot, have I shown you guys these ones before or no? All right. Actually, I might dim a couple of these lights. Actually, are some of them dimmed?
Yeah, actually, if you want one more.
Yeah, do one more and see. All right. Again, some of these are just going to give you a sense of place. McDonald's delivery, lots of countries around the world. McDonald's is actually kind of fancy, expensive food. And so they have things like delivery. A lot of places I went, actually, they had, McDonald's would have their own kind of like trolley. And so you could jump on it for free if you would go to the local McDonald's. It's kind of a unusual thing. Oh, and my guide didn't know a lot about Minnesota, but when we were in a store, he told me that he thought since I was Minnesota, maybe I'd want to buy one of these as a memento. He'd mostly just been to the state fair, and he was just like, "You guys just fry everything, right? You just love that." It's like, I guess we do. So this is Egypt. Quite sunny, quite warm Christmas time, as you might imagine. Very often people are a bit surprised because they think of a place like Egypt as being very conservative, but it depends on where you go in the region, right? Places like Saudi Arabia will be very orthodox. I would say in Egypt, although there obviously the majority is Islamic, the attitude is more of a live and let live kind of a thing. Especially since there have been tourists coming to Egypt for literally thousands of years, right? The tourist industry kind of had its start because of Egypt. There being big monumental things that people would want to see from far away. And there are actually very few, but there are some people who practice the ancient Egyptian religion. They mostly do this just to try to, be unique, really. Not a lot of adherents anymore, but big tourist destination. In Egypt, I talk about a couple things that will come up in future chapters since we're in this place. The Nile goes through Egypt, and traditionally each year the Nile is fed from Central Africa and the rainforest and whatnot. And because there's so much rain in the rainforest, as you might imagine, it washes a lot of nutrients out of the soils, but that is actually, although that's a detriment for a lot of tropical places because their nutrients get leached out and their food would have less of those nutrients. Downstream, down the Nile, when there's annual floods, because you'll have a rainy season in Central Africa, and that will lead to flooding downriver in places like Egypt. And so along the floodplain, year after year, all those nutrients were deposited. And so Egypt itself, although it's one of the driest places in the world, it has some of the best agricultural land, and of course, obviously, a pretty constant source of water. This is just kind of a normal store that I went by, but I took a picture of it because it has fixed price listed. Have I talked to you guys about what that means? Anyone know what that means if you see fixed price at a store in the window? You guys haven't traveled that far yet? This is actually somewhat of a standard thing if you travel most places of Asia, much of Africa, Middle East. Fixed price, that's a little bit of a complicated story, I guess. You guys know what haggling is? Haggling, kind of. The norm in places around the world when it comes to shopping is very often they won't put prices on things because mostly they're trying to size you up and trying to guesstimate how much you could afford. How much you could afford is how much you're going to pay, rather than in our minds we think about, well, how about how much the thing costs to make? Shouldn't that be more of how much it costs to buy? And it's like, well, yes and no. Yes and no. I found out when I first started traveling pretty rapidly that, well, they will ask you questions which seem friendly. You know, they'll be like, "Oh, hi, what's your name? Oh, what country you're from? And oh, you're from there. Oh, that's interesting." And they're really trying to size you up and how much money you have. And they know Americans, if they travel, they want to shop. That is, as a general rule, they want to grab mementos to bring back home to their friends and family. Very common thing for Americans. Now, for example, if you are Australian, they know Australians travel a lot. And so if you guys travel in your future, maybe do study abroad or who knows what. If someone, it goes to the store and you're walking in with them and someone asks them where they're from and they say, "Oh, I'm Australian." And they're like, "Oh, that's great. Hugh Jackman, right? He's Australian." And they're like, "That's right." And they will actually get the Australians a low price for things because Australians are known for a norm of travel, but they save up for it and they usually travel for like maybe a year or two, and they're not traveling to shop. They're traveling just to experience places. Just some places have much more of a social norm of world travel. But they will only buy things if they really need it. So they'll be given the lowest prices for things. So an example of haggling would be, you go in here and you see something that you want and you ask them how much, and they may say $10, and then you would say, "Well, I only have 5. And they say, "Well, I could sell it to you for 9. You'd be like, "Oh, I found another $1 so I could do 6. Right? You do this kind of thing. I hate it, honestly. A lot of people love it. A lot of people love haggling. I just hate it. And so I'm always looking for a fixed price place where I know how much things are going to cost, and if I want something, I will buy it. Because the haggling, I just feel like, let's just cut to the middle point of whatever it is we're going to agree to. Haggling. So Egypt, like many areas of the world, like I said, I'm going to talk about a couple of different things that are going to be in future chapters, like agriculture and urbanization, just because I'm trying to give you a big picture of the region, and we'll talk about religion as well, obviously. So for example, for many, many years, the best transportation was via water. And so most places had put in canals, and canals also very conveniently bring water to different areas, right? So you could use it as a way to bring water, especially a place like Egypt that you have your river and that's about it. Many places around the world, like the US even, used to have a bunch of canals, and that's how people got around in lots of major cities. It's tough to like picture New York with canals, but if you go to New York or LA and you're on Canal Street, we just fill them in. Much of the rest of the world leaves their canals there, even though they're not used that much for shipping. But what used to happen was you'd have a boat and you'd just have a rope and you would tie it to a horse or something, and it would just walk along, and you could just have, 1 or 2 horses or maybe a cow could transport a huge shipment along these canals as part of their reason they were put in. In Egypt, actually, you'll see lots of buildings where the tops are not finished off. You guys know why that would be in Egypt? Why that would be a common thing? Well, how their tax structure worked, if your building wasn't technically completed and it was still under construction, their tax rates were by square feet times how many levels. And so if you have an area that's under construction, they wouldn't tax you for this level, and that tax break goes for 5 years. So usually every 5 years, since they're not saving money anymore, they'll then finish that level and put on another half-built level. But it has to have this half-built look to qualify. If they tried to tidy it up or something, it wouldn't count. So that's how you could tell the age of lots of buildings, though. It's just you just count up the levels and. Some of the ancient buildings and whatnot in Egypt. This is the pyramid. I don't know if you can tell from this angle. This is the Muhammad Ali Mosque. Muhammad Ali Mosque, which obviously was not named after the boxer. The boxer was named after the original Muhammad Ali. But this is one of the more sacred mosques, sacred places in Egypt. It's also one of the larger mosques I've ever been to. Unfortunately, none of my photos inside of it really turned out. The lighting is a bit weird. This light stone here, this is a special stone that you could only find in Egypt called alabaster. And it kind of glows, and so it just does wonky things to pictures if you're inside of a building. But it gives it a very kind of like dreamlike quality. When you travel to places, it's always good to research cultural norms and practices, right? And so if you're going to go to like the most famous mosque that is in the country, it's like when I went to the Vatican, right? You do research on like, well, what are people supposed to wear or whatnot, right? And if in the Vatican, for example, you might find out that, oh, actually you dress conservatively, like you wear something that covers up your sleeves, and women usually cover up with a scarf over their head. Like that kind of thing is for the Vatican if you visit, right? And there are people who don't do that. When I went, to Egypt, as I said, I read up on kind of the norms and stuff and dressed very conservatively. But there were tourists who went into here wearing like their swimsuits, like they came from the beach, And I was actually surprised that people weren't upset. Like I assumed that like people would be like, "What are you doing?" And I asked my guide about it, and he said that it was an Egypt thing. He said that there's more of a live and let live attitude, right? There are religious hardliners in the country. In fact, every Christmas, usually one Christian site or other is bombed by like radical groups. But the majority of the population are very much more of what he said was, what's right for us is not right for you. What's right for you is not right for someone else. And so we have this live and let live attitude. I asked him a little bit about prayer that he was doing, because as I'm sure you all know from our readings, but there's a traditional prayer 5 times a day, right? Prayer 5 times a day. And so you'll see people just kind of like stopping what they're doing, spend a little bit of time to pray. And I had noticed people that had finished praying and were leaving. They seemed extremely like peaceful, And like I said, I was expecting like people to be upset and angry at these ugly American tourists, right, who are wearing their swimsuits, wearing their flip-flops. He said to me, Islam is a religion of peace. So of course. And there was another guy in our tour group who was kind of like, well, what do you mean there's wars in the Middle East and among Islam people? What do you mean it's a religion of peace? And my guide said that when they pray, God to them, how do I describe this? if I think about prayer, I will think about like asking God for stuff, that kind of a thing. He said what they do, to them, God is peace. And so when they're praying, they actually try to push everything out of their minds and think of nothing, right? Think of nothing. And so to me, it seems very similar to a meditation that a lot of people do when they're trying to like defeat anxiety, especially, right? You specifically detach from the world's problems and try to think of nothing except for, well, nothing, right? And so he said that's why people seem so peaceful. It was an interesting time. You could see a little bit of the glowing. At night, it's much more. A number of the rock actually in Egypt has natural glow-in-the-dark properties, but they didn't show up in pictures at all. That's the thing with pictures. As I mentioned, this is a place that is kind of well known for having other religions here historically, right? We got the carvings. Depictions of the ancient gods are kind of everywhere, and people are relatively well versed of the different ancient gods and kind of what they were about. I forgot if I showed you. Have I showed you guys any of these pictures from Egypt? I don't think so. Well, as you can see, these have been defaced, like literally defaced. Bird tried to make a nest in the face of one of them. The ancient depictions that were under sand, which is a lot of them, those are not defaced, so we know what they look like not being defaced. But the ones that were above ground, can people think of why that would happen? Why would someone deface these? Yeah.
So when you get conquered, it's kind of like taking your identity from you? Power move?
Yeah. So there was a group that was after the ancient Egyptians who took over control of the area. People know who that was? What kind of people would have chiseled out those faces?
Persians?
No, it was the Christians. Christians actually, for hundreds of years, had control of Egypt in this whole little area, and these were considered pagan gods in the very classical sense, right? It's so ironic that they chisel out the faces, because that is actually not how you identify Egyptian gods. Egyptian gods, let me go back a couple. So Egyptian gods are all supposed to look identical, because they're supposed to be an ideal being, right? They're supposed to look perfect and the same, because if they're an ideal, they don't have multiple ways that they look, right? And so that's why if you see ancient Egyptian, if it seems really kind of monotonous, it's like, oh, the faces are all exactly the same. It's like, well, that's on purpose. And it's the hats that you can tell who is who. And when they had depictions of conquered people, then they would look different. They would look like, each one has a little bit of its own personality, right? It's like, oh, this guy has a shaved head, and, this guy has this type of haircut, and these are actually depictions of all the enslaved people that Egypt had enslaved. So they actually try to have an indication of a type of person from each of the different kingdoms that they had taken over, right? But there's a bit more of a unique look to them compared to the depictions of the gods. Lots of defunct religions in the world. This is Central Cairo. Central Cairo, many of cities of the world that have ancient histories are really congested when it comes to traffic. Really congested. Part of that is because you can't expand roads and put highways through major cities if a whole bunch of the buildings are not only historic but have religious significance, right? When they put through the highways through in the U.S., they destroyed neighborhoods. They're very often the lower income neighborhoods that were just kind of destroyed and highways were put through them. Some places there were protests and highways kind of stop at certain areas and then pick up at others because neighborhoods didn't want to be demolished necessarily. But that, like I said, causes traffic problems in lots of ancient cities. Just giving you a little bit of a sense of a place out and about in Egypt. This was a little, I think the term is paddy wagon. The police in Egypt, this is before the revolution actually, but the police would go around and kind of round up people quite often and take them off to jail. Usually these were, remember I told you how there was the norm of like haggling, right? Have I told you guys about the origin of the Arab Spring, the story? I think maybe sometime. All right. Well, in a nutshell, a number of countries in the region, people felt like they were being treated very unfairly, right? And so, let's see, do I have a picture of a checkpoint? Let's see here. Just normal street signs in Egypt. Well, actually, that's a whole different story. Let me go to where I'm trying to find. Okay, now I'm going to give up on what I was trying to find. Well, there are all kinds of checkpoints as you're driving around. And when you get to a checkpoint, they will usually say that there's a fee to pass. And there is and there isn't. They want you to pay some money, so it's a bit of a shakedown. And a lot of locals would have this happen to them so much that they would just consider it harassment and just the police trying to take all their money, right? So there's a lot of animosity building up. This is before the revolution, but that's a big part of the revolution when it happened. People were feeling more and more like they were getting ripped off by the government. Also, Hosni Mubarak had been president for 40 years, and when decolonization happened and lots of countries took back their countries from the colonial powers, you often had a strongman kind of character who would be the leader, and they'd say something like, I'll be the first president of this country until we organize elections. And people would think of, like George Washington, right, who did not declare himself the king of the United States. Said that there would be democratic elections and he would just be the first president. Well, a number of these different presidents just never gave up their office. And in Syria, the guy Assad, who had that position of power and control, he had passed on his position of power to his son. So it de facto meant that he did declare himself king, basically, right? If you're going to have your son take over for you, it's like, well, then you're more of a king. People saw that had happened in Syria, and they were worried that would happen because it looked like Mubarak was setting up his sons to take over. So lots of these things kind of came together. This was actually this picture. As I mentioned, there's bombings that happen sometimes. One of the places we were going to go to was an old Christian church, but was called off because someone blew up a bomb there and killed a few people, right? So these are the kind of tensions that happen. As I said, Christians are a minority, about 13% of the population. Well, when we'd come back from places and we'd come into our hotel, the security always scans your bags looking for bombs or who knows what, right? And so one night we were coming back, and one of the guard, he called me over. He's like, hey, what are you trying to pull here? What are you doing? And I looked at it and I was kind of like, is that my phone on top of my camera? And it makes it look like some weird gun? Like, that's weird. And then he pressed the button and it vanished. And he went, gotcha. I was like, you got me, you know. If I had been more of a nervous person, probably would have cracked myself with someone with a machine gun accusing me of trying to smuggle in a gun. Especially when there had been bombings against people recently, but, you know, sense of humor has changed everywhere. Some more of the canals. As we were eating, there was a family that walked by outside the restaurant, and my guide said, "Oh, hey, they're also Christians, so you should say hi." It was like, really, just anyone on the street who's okay? And it's actually not in the picture, but we were eating what is a very common thing for dinner in Egypt, which is pigeon, which I'd never eaten before. And they stuff it with beans and rice and different stuff, but pigeon, not a lot of meat on a pigeon, FYI. They mostly just use it as a thing to cook the stuffing. Well, it was in fact a family who were of the local Coptic Christians, if you've ever heard that term before, Coptic Christians. But as you can see on the necklace, and he said he could tell that they were dressed up for Christmas, which confused me at the time because I had forgotten that they use a different calendar. So Christmas isn't on the same day. Places that use different calendars, so it was just like. But he said they were dressed up for Christmas, and he said the necklace is an example of what many of the Coptic Christians try to emulate, which is you have the cross, of course, meaning they're Christian, but the other symbol is physically an Egyptian symbol, and this is their way of saying, I am both of these things. I don't have to pick one or the other, right? And it's only the extremists in Egypt who say that if you're Egyptian, you need to be Islamic, and that there should be a state required religion, right? Even with Hosni Mubarak being a dictator for 40 years, he kept the state secular. And it wasn't until the Arab Spring, they did make an effort to have elections. The Islamic Brotherhood, I don't know if people have ever heard of that group. Well, the Islamic Brotherhood are pretty conservative. When Hosni Mubarak was president, they weren't allowed to run for any political office because they're considered too much extremists. But they're actually a political party, the Muslim Brotherhood. They have a lot of money. They have a lot of rich people who are members. And through the years, they had been known for a number of different kind of charitable acts and kind of good deeds. And so when the Arab Spring did happen, they were allowed to have an election that was a free and fair election. They actually won enough seats that they were able to get the presidency. And the first thing they did was change the Constitution so that you did have a mandated religion. If you lived in Egypt, you had to be Islamic. And it wasn't a surprise to anyone that is what they did, because that is what they had said that they were going to do. But you had the majority of the country didn't want that. So then you had even more protests and more fighting than there was before. Eventually, the military came in and said that the election was null and void. The Constitution wasn't going to be changed. And the military said that they were just going to keep control until elections could be set up at some time in the future. Still hasn't really happened. But that is how, some states have specific religions that they mandate. The Coptic Christians are very often they're discriminated against. Many of them work in garbage recycling because it's a job they're allowed to do. But it depends. This is her sister again, dressed up for Christmas dinner. I forgot to say the Coptic Christians are are the most directly descended from the old Egyptians, who were the rulers for thousands of years. The other populations, similar to how the Christians came in later and converted a lot of the local population, Islamic populations came in later. And that's the majority of the population there is the Arab populations who come in much later. I'm going to show you the Aswan Dam. This is further down in Egypt, closer to Sudan, near the border with Sudan. And you could probably see the people have changed. These are more of the Nubian people, if you've ever heard that term. A bunch of major kingdoms in Egypt were actually down in the Nubian area, because all along the Nile were kingdoms. Some of the things being sold. You can see that the way of dressing is a bit different, right? So I mentioned before about how on the Nile, right, you have annual floods, and these floods put down good topsoil. Well, as an economic development strategy, a lot of places put in dams, right? And dams can serve a few different purposes. One of them is they provide hydroelectric power, right? And there's lots of places that need power. People kind of tend to think that all places in the Middle East have lots of oil, but they don't. Egypt has some oil, but it doesn't have a lot. Especially in the southern part of the country has less. So a dam with hydroelectric power, there's a lot of trade-offs when countries kind of have to make these choices. So another thing that happens when you put in a dam is you have a big reservoir of water behind it, and that's part of the reason you have it, is because then you have a big reservoir for whatever you might need it for. There's a drought or who knows what you might need it for. But because this is in one of the driest areas of the world, about half of the water that would have normally run down the river and gone all the way through the country evaporates off before it hits the actual Nile River itself. And also those annual floods that put down topsoil, there's no more flooding, because that's another reason that people put in dams, is because usually you have major cities that are around rivers, and you don't want them to be flooded out regularly, right? You want that to be stable. Like if you walk down by the river around here, we got tons of concrete and stuff all around it, right? So that it doesn't flood out every year. As I said, these are a bunch of the kind of choices that places have to make development-wise. And in this area, actually, a bunch of the ancient ruins and whatnot that were connected to the ancient Egyptians are now under a big lake. And so they also had to decide about giving out a certain amount of tourist money. They moved some to higher locations, but it was just too expensive to really move entire temples and whatnot. So this is on the Nile, actually, and along the Nile there are a lot of places that the soil fertility was getting less and less through time. Kind of depended on where you went. More of those rooftops. Yeah, it's too dark. A lot of the area where the soil is just not quite good enough, they turn that to grazing land, quite a bit of grazing land that used to be more agricultural. As I said, Hosni Mubarak had been president for 40 years. He also really liked to name stuff after himself, which can be confusing if you have multiple roads that are called Mubarak Road, and it goes to Mubarak Hospital that is next to Mubarak Park that is next to Mubarak Place. And oh, this is the picture I was actually trying to look for earlier when I was talking about how people are stopped by the police just regularly, and the police will say that they're checking for, make sure you don't have contraband, right? There are bombings that happen, they're gonna check and make sure you don't have a bomb. But very often the purpose is to try to shake someone down for some money, right? And so this guy has a bit of a concerned look on his face, and it's not because he's hauling something that's illegal. It's because he's thinking about how much money he has in his pocket and how much money they're going to ask. And if he doesn't have enough, they will put him in one of those paddy wagons and send him to jail. And then someone from his family has to bring his fine down and pay it to get him out. So they're going to get that money either way. And he doesn't know how much that's going to be. They're trying to evaluate how much stuff he has and how much they think he probably has on him, right? These things aren't set fees, even though they'll kind of say they are. I don't know if this stuff is still the norm in Egypt post-Arab Spring. It was something that was very, very embedded in the culture. This is just some of the carvings from the area. You know, the way people dress, especially women, tends to be more traditional. And it's interesting, actually, I don't know if you could tell, but how tight the clothing is at the cuffs is actually to keep out sand, and that's another reason to have it really tight around the head. The sand, there's winds, because in the desert there's not a lot of vegetation to slow down wind, and little bits of sand surprisingly can hit you quite hard as you're out and about. I found this out the first times I went swimming and had a swimsuit. That's why I don't know if you remember the picture with all the swimmers. There's all these barriers everywhere because little pellets of sand will keep on just smacking you. Fair amount of the infrastructure in Egypt is connected to getting water around because, you know, it is a desert, but it has one of the best sources of water that any real desert has. But if you're in Egypt, you have a good amount of water, but you wouldn't want to drink the water out of the tap because it's very, very chlorinated. And so, like, you know, if you've been to a pool that is really chlorinated, like that's what it's like if you turn on the tap. And so if you are there, you know, you drink bottled water. If you're gonna really cook with something where the water is something you're gonna taste, you're gonna want to buy that water. But the tap water, very processed, very processed. And that's a picture of Hosni Mubarak, who also just had his picture everywhere. One of the many checkpoints we went by. There have been quite a bit of overbuilding happening in Egypt, and it's really unfortunate that they had done a bunch of overbuilding right before the Arab Spring because the tourist economy really plummeted after the Arab Spring. Went down to like 10% of what it was before. At the time, there was a lot more tourists coming, specifically people who were getting money who were Russian, a lot of Russian tourists at the time. And so there was a bit of a flow of money, and people had thought that there would be this larger demand in the future. And it's not really come back. Obviously, tourism didn't really come back during the pandemic. It's still considered less safe compared to how it was. Oh, and this is as I was coming back. I went through Paris, and while I was in Paris, I was reminded about how much loot and stuff was taken from specifically Egypt and is now just decorating parts of Europe, right? I think they could probably like make a reproduction and probably give stuff back to Egypt. That is what Egypt would like. As I was going to these different ancient sites in Egypt, lots of well, you know, you would see these giant statues and it'd be like, well, it's nice, but where's the head? And they'd be like, France. It's like, oh, well, where's the arm? It's like, Britain. It's like, oh, where's the other thing? It's like, it's in Italy. Much of Europe still has the riches that they took from these countries during their big imperial times. This is just what a market looks like. All right. again, sticking with the same region in general that we've been covering, I'm going to switch to talk about Jewish cultural regions. One of the biggest kind of differences, obviously, well, a lot of cultures have a diaspora, right? But it's especially the case if you have a population who are expelled from a country. And that still happens like all the time. If you recall, when we were looking at different maps that were put together during colonial times, they'd be put together in ways that you would have certain ethnic groups that are perhaps the vast majority, and you have other ethnic groups that are small minorities. Empires very often, this is part of the reason the term genocide is a term is empires will take over territories, and I was actually reading about the Mongolian Empire recently. The Mongolian Empire, huge, large empire in its day, but when it would take over areas, if an ethnicity was especially fought back against their invasion, because normally when empires take over an area, typically they will kill about a quarter of the population during the invasion, and then during the early occupation they'll kill about another quarter of the population, mostly so they could just take all those people's stuff and then move their own populations in, right? This is just typical empire stuff. The Mongolian Empire, if there are any groups that were especially fighting against them, they would vow to kill everyone of that ethnicity. And so there are ethnicities that have been vanished from the world, right? From different empires. And the history of the Jewish populations is a similar thing. The Mongolian Empire, not only would they kill everyone of an ethnicity, they would destroy all the writings of their language and destroy all the cultural artifacts, art, and anything like that of that culture, so that there would be no evidence that it existed, which is crazy, right? It's crazy, but it still happens. The Serbian War, Bosnia-Herzegovina, the Serbians killed a lot of the Islamic populations who were neighbors, but they also went after the libraries and tried to destroy historical evidence linking Islamic populations in that part, historically, in that part of Europe. They wanted to wipe out the evidence of that, right? It's rare that a diaspora has populations that go back to the origination place, because very often when there's a diaspora and populations move to a new place, usually they just like figure how things out in that new place, and they just kind of stay there because that's where everyone they know is, right? Now, obviously, Second World War, Holocaust, right? There was a big emphasis on needing a homeland to have a territory to defend, right? So that if there was a future effort to get rid of you as a people, you would have a specific, your place, your territory. Part of this was, during the Second World War, obviously the Germans, what they attempted to say and create as a cultural norm was that you're only a people if you have a place. You're only a people. And so their argument among the Germans and the Nazis was that people like Jewish populations, the Romani people, lots of different populations that live in Europe but are not from Europe, the Germans defined them as non-people, right? And so there was this effort of like, we need to have a country, territory, we need to have all the kind of norms. Now, when the Jewish populations moved back to Israel, there were some Jewish populations who already lived there, but most of the movement came after the end of the Second World War, and it was mostly Jewish people from Europe, right? The local population who lived there, well, there are people who had moved in, right? Palestinians, people who had moved into these areas that, well, Israel, its last owner was the colonizer of Britain, because Israel was a colony of Britain. And so Britain sold a bunch of land to European Jewish populations as a place that they could go back to. There are a whole bunch of people living on that land who thought it was theirs because they lived there for generations, right? They and everyone they knew lived on this land. And when these populations started coming in, the locals saw it as just more colonialism, right? They saw it as a bunch of Europeans are coming in here to live and kicking us off of our land, right? And genetically, the Jewish population in Europe, they're about 50-50 European heritage and 50% heritage from the Middle East, right? Because this population that's been mixing for thousands of years, it's been living in Europe for thousands of years, so populations just mix. So like I said, they saw that as an invading population. So it's all that is complicated, I guess, is what I'm saying. Because like I said, there's diaspora of lots of different people around the world, people who've had migrations of choice, have had migrations that were forced, all kinds of things that have moved people around. Let's see. Well, I'm feeling a little brain fried after all that, so I think I'm just going to let you go a couple minutes early, and I'll pick this up next time. Thanks for coming.